Welcome to Signage and the MUTCD, Part 2, brought to you by the South Carolina LTAP. I'll be your instructor, Todd Morrison. Today we're going to be talking about the Manual and Uniform Traffic Control Devices. Very important document put out by the Federal Highway Administration. It's been adopted as law in South Carolina, and anytime they put down a pavement marking, a stripe, a stop bar, an arrow, or any type of sign that's used for traffic control, it needs to meet the guidelines found in the MUTCD. If you'd like to get a copy of that, you can go to the website there, mutcd.fhwa.dot.gov, or you could simply use your favorite search engine, look for 2009 MUTCD. It'll pull it up as a PDF, and you can use that to read through the manual and become more familiar with it. Now, in this series, we did have a part 1, and I want to mention that to you in case you haven't watched that yet. I'd love for you to go back and take a look at that as well. In part 1, we discussed what is the MUTCD? When does it apply? How do we use it? And why do we use it? We also looked at proper use and installation of signs. In part 2, we're going to go a little bit further. We're going to talk about the reasons why you would install signs. And sometimes there's reasons that have to be met before we install the signs. So we'll talk about some of those. We'll also look at the usage of MUTCD signs. There I'll go over some of the other signs that we find and just familiarize you with those. And then last, we're going to wrap it up looking at the pavement markings. And again, the pavement markings are the stripes, the stop bars, the crosswalks, etc. So we'll start off with reasons for sign installation. Now, if we're talking about warning signs, then it could be a change in the road coming up in horizontal alignment. That would be a curve warning sign. It could be signage warning us about intersections that are coming up. That'd be the side road or the offset road signs. It could be talking about a narrow roadway or a steep downhill grade. It could also be talking about a road being slippery when wet. A lot of reasons that we might install warning signs. So let's take a look at a few of those. The first is the narrow bridge sign. You see it there in the fluorescent version of it. This is one that, if you remember from the first webinar, we have as shall, shoulds, and mays. Shalls are things written in bold that are standards, something we really absolutely have to do unless there is engineering judgment that is overriding that. But otherwise, it's something we've got to follow. Should statements, which were guidance statements, they had the verb should in those, something we should do unless there's a very good reason not to. And with those, that reason not to needed to be on the order of magnitude of an engineering study or engineering judgment. And then we had options. We can do this or not, purely up to you whether you do them or not. So when we talk about the narrow bridge sign, I have placed in italics those things that are should conditions. So as a guidance statement or a should condition, it should go in advance of any bridge or culvert with two-way traffic, north and southbound, that has a width of 16 to 18 feet. Or a bridge or a culvert that is not as wide as the approach roadway. And then it's an option if we have narrow or eliminated shoulders. Maybe we have a nice 3-4 foot wide paved shoulder, but when we get to the bridge, that disappears. And those are reasons why we might install the narrow bridge sign. Let's take the one-lane bridge sign next. If you have a 2-lane road, that means two-way traffic, north and south, east and west, and that roadway width is less than 16 feet. The bridge itself is 15 feet across, let's say 15 feet in width. In that case, we need to place the one-lane bridge sign up. It's a should condition. That's why they're shown in italics. If we have a lot of heavy trucks, commercial vehicles that are on that road, We could also consider doing that at less than 18 feet. Or if it's a sharp curve coming into the bridge, we could also consider it at 18 feet or less. And here we see the hill and the grade signs. And these are things that we could install to give more guidance to those commercial vehicle drivers to let them know what is coming up. And it becomes a should condition or a guidance statement when those grades get steep enough and they're long enough. And this is what we find from the MUTCD. Just as an example, the first one there is a 5% grade and more than 3,000 feet long. Then we should put up the hill and grade sign, the W7-1 or the W7-1A. And there's a placard that we can put underneath the W7-1 that lets those commercial vehicle drivers know what that grade is. Now let's talk about speed limits and setting speed limits and what the reasons are, considerations in setting those speed limits. And I'm talking about now other than statutory. So in other words, your state legislature could have adopted a speed limit for all classifications of roadways as a maximum. And then if you're going to place a speed that is different than the maximum set for that class of roadway by statute, then that shall be based on an engineering study. And when we do that engineering study, most of the time we're looking at the 85th percentile speed. To give you a example of what that means, 85th percentile speed, you want to go to free-flowing traffic, so you're not near a traffic signal or anything like that, and you'll get a radar gun, and you'll take the speed of the vehicles that are going past you. And if I were to record the speed of the first 100 vehicles that came by, let's say it's a 35 mile per hour speed limit zone. Currently, maybe the slowest vehicle that came by, that one was doing 20. And maybe the fastest one was doing 55. And I go ahead and number those or write those down on my list or on my piece of paper from 20 to 55. And I write those from 1 to 100. When I get up to number 85, that particular speed is the speed at which 85% of those vehicles are traveling at or less. And so oftentimes we do a speed radar study. Most of the time we will. And the MUTCD says that whatever speed you select that is outside of the statute, it needs to be within 5 miles per hour. And when I say needs to be, I mean should be within 5 miles per hour of that 85th percentile speed. Some other things that you can consider in that engineering study are the road surface characteristics. Is this a gravel or a dirt road? Is it the grade, the alignment? So is it one curve followed by another without any sight distance because of trees? We can look at the pace speed, roadside development. So in the city, if it's in an urban area, very well developed, then that can affect where we set that speed. And we can also look at crash history. But if you're the person that is considering changing speed limits from something other than statute, definitely read that section of the MUTCD, get an engineer involved, and do an engineering study. Now, if you're going to reduce the speed limit more than 10 miles per hour, then this particular sign becomes a should condition. So in this case, if my speed limit were 55 miles an hour and I'm dropping it down to 30, then I've got to have this reduce speed ahead sign. And so we've talked a little bit about speed, talked about some of the bridge signage. Now I want to talk about the considerations for right-of-way control. And when I say right-of-way control, I'm talking about an intersection, whether it be a T intersection, a crossroad intersection. We have to decide who gets to go, who's going to stop. What kind of control? Are we going to have yield signs? Are we going to have stop signs, traffic control signals, etc.? The MUTCD says that decision should be based upon engineering judgment with the consideration of the volumes of vehicles, bicyclists, pedestrians, the number, angle of approaches, the speeds, the sight distance, and the crash performance. we need to consider all those items in our decision on how to set that right-of-way control, or when to use the stop, when to use the yield sign. And then it goes on to say that a yield or a stop sign should be used in these cases: intersection of a less important road with a main road, where application of the right-of-way rule is hazardous. The right-of-way rule comes from the Uniform Vehicle Code, and it says that in the absence of any kind of control, if I have a crossroad where I don't have any stop signs, no yield signs, not anything at all out there, then whoever gets there first has the right-of-way. They get to go first. But if you get there both at the same time, then the vehicle on the right is the one that has the right-of-way, the one on the left shall yield. And it gives us some other reasons or situations when a stop sign should be used. You might also be thinking about that crossroad. When do I make this a four-way stop? So a four-way stop would be considered a multi-way stop. And multi-way stop sign usage, before you do that, you got to do an engineering study. And that engineering study should look at many things, many factors that are involved. The biggest one is volume. So we got to make sure that the traffic volume on both intersecting roadways is approximately equal. And then below that, I've listed out some of the reasons from the MUTCD that you could use a multi-way stop. One is a enter measure before signal installation. That means that it's already met the warrants for a traffic control signal. You just haven't got that project going, you haven't got that funded, or it's coming in the next few months. Then you could put up a four-way stop or an all-way stop in the meantime. We can also look at the crashes, and 5 or more related crashes in a 12-month period would generate, or would mean that that particular four-way intersection would meet the warrants for a multi-way stop. Doesn't mean we have to install it, but it means it would meet the warrants for that. And those have to be crashes that could be prevented or reduced by the stop signs themselves. And then there's also some volume requirements as well. And this all comes straight out of the MUTCD. So again, if you're the person that is trying to decide, when do I put up these stop signs, this is something you need to be familiar with. And most of the time it's going to require an engineering study. So I encourage you to get an engineer involved. Now here's when stop signs should not be used. They should not be used purely for speed control. And we used to see that occasionally, where a city would come in and in between two crossroads in the middle of the street, they would put up stop signs. And it was there as an attempt to get people to stop and slow down on that city street. But it's not advised. It's a should condition saying you should not do that. And there's many reasons why. Because if the public doesn't perceive a need to stop, then they might slow down a little bit, but they're going to start having contempt for all stop signs. It really leads to higher speeds as well. That's what the studies show. In between those stop signs, they may come to a rolling stop in the middle of the street, but then they're going to speed up to try to make up that time before they get to the next stop sign. So that's why the MUTCD says stop signs should not be used purely for speed control. It's for right-of-way assignment is why we have those at an intersection. Here's an example of one of those that was installed. There's no reason for these stop signs other than they were trying to slow the public down. And that's what we want to avoid. So those are the stop signs. Now let's look at the stop ahead signs. The stop ahead sign starts off as an option. It's a may condition. Something we can put up if we want to draw more attention to the need to stop, or as a result of some crashes that we've had, we're trying to get more attention to that intersection. But then it goes to a shall condition when the stop sign is not visible for a sufficient distance for a vehicle coming up to that stop sign to come to a safe stop. In other words, if I can't see my stop sign far enough away to realize that there's a need to stop, take my foot off the gas, put it on the brake, and bring my vehicle to a safe stop, then I've got to have this stop ahead sign installed. So what is that distance? That stopping sight distance, what's needed or what's required for your average passenger vehicle on level ground, is given by this chart. And you can see at 55 miles an hour, it's 495 feet. So if you're listening today and you're with the county and a lot of your roads are 55 miles an hour, just tell your crews that are out there trimming those trees that we need to be able to see those stop signs a tenth of a mile away. Tenth of a mile is 528 feet. It's easy to measure out in the field, and you'll definitely meet the requirements of this chart. And that gives us just a look at some of the reasons for why we would install signage, some of the considerations, some of the warrants that are there. Now, what I'd like to do next is look at some of the different MUTCD signs and talk about how we use those. Not going to be able to go over all those, but give you a nice grouping or collection of those. In this photo, you can see some different signs that are allowed to be used. We find these in the MUTCD. I like this one at the top left. This is a special placard for motorcyclists. It lets them know, and I'll show you some more pictures of this later coming up, but lets them know that this condition coming up applies to them. Whatever we're trying to warn the public of specifically applies to them. We've got signs that are available and either required or recommended at different times for roundabouts. And this is the black and white chevron collection. Then we have large animal signs, photo enforcement, push button for pedestrian signals, photo enforcement, and a lot of other signs that are available. And as you're installing those, I want to let you know that in part one, we discussed the colors, but I wanted to mention to you that you can have an optional fluorescent version of many of the standard colors. That's true for stop signs. It's also true for warning signs. In this photo, I'm showing you the fluorescent version of that warning sign versus the standard color. And you can see how much it stands out better. It's more visible to the public. The sheet of material is a little bit more expensive, but I would encourage you to use it if you have it available to you. And when we talk about school zones, any sign that's related to the school, such as the school bus stop ahead, is required to be fluorescent yellow, green in color, as you see here. And then that particular color, the fluorescent yellow, green, is also an option for pedestrian, bicyclist, and playground signs. And if those signs occur within the school zone, then definitely we want to put those as fluorescent yellow, green so that they all match. And when we use these supplemental placards underneath these school crossing zone assembly signs, then we want to make sure they match as well. And this photo, this particular agency didn't do that. They're using fluorescent yellow, green at the top, but they're using the standard yellow at the bottom. And so it's definitely not something that's allowed. They would need to swap that out. When they do, just on a side note, I would love to see an air gap here in between these two signs. That way it's easier to see this pentagon shape, which is important to the public, but also allows for a little bit of expansion and contraction. The FHWA would suggest a 1-inch air gap in between these signs. And as you go through the MUTCD, you're going to find that roundabouts have a lot of information in there. A lot of information on how we can let the traffic know about the roundabout that's coming up, to warn them, and to give them specific guidance. So I'll cover a few of those. These are lane assignment signs, and there is an optional fishhook that is available for those just for roundabouts. So on our roundabouts, we can use the standard lane assignment signs or the fishhooks, and my preference is to use the fishhooks because they give the public better information about what's coming up. In the center island, we're going to put some signs that indicate to the public that it is one direction counterclockwise flow. And this top one is going to be a single lane roundabout. The next two are going to be multi-lane roundabouts. And again, in that central island. And then we can also place the sign on the right as you approach it, just so the public knows what's going on. In advance of that roundabout, we can place the roundabout W2-6 sign with a supplemental placard underneath it if we wish. And depending upon the speed, that might become a guidance statement. So that's a should statement for 40 miles per hour or more. And that is the speed limit as you're coming into that roundabout. Looking more in Part 2C, we'll find shoulder signs and plaques. I'll talk about a couple of these, low shoulder and shoulder drop-off signs. The low shoulder signs are going to be if you have a shoulder drop between 0 to 3 inches. Well, be more than 0, but less than 3 inches, we're going to place a low shoulder sign as an option. Once we get to being more than 3 inches, then it's going to be the shoulder drop sign with the optional placard underneath it. And actually, for me, it's going to be fix it if we can at all, because when it gets to be 3 inches or more, that is definitely a problem for the motorist. It leads to a lot of overcorrection when they drop off the road, which leads to out of control skidding across the roadway into oncoming traffic, head-on collisions, or all the way across all the lanes and into fixed object hazards, trees, etc. on the other side of the road. So my advice is, rather than placing this sign on the right, fix the shoulders, if at all possible. The MUTCD also has a lot of surface condition signs, and these are just warning the public about what's coming up with the roadway. You may have the bridge, ices before the roadway, and then we have slippery when wet sign, and there's placards we can put underneath it that actually can give more detail about when it's slippery. They go underneath this W8-5, but it could be a steel deck bridge, or it could be oil, excess oil on the roadway. And there's some signs out there that let motorcyclists know of things that might be a hazard for them. Grooved pavement, metal bridge decks, neither one of these are good for motorcyclists. And this is the placard that we saw earlier that is letting the motorcyclists know that this sign is specifically for them. And I'm showing it here below and above because it can be placed in either position, wherever you think it's going to be most easily recognized by the motorcyclist. There's also warning signs for adverse weather conditions that we could install. There's a combination sign for pedestrian and bicyclist crossings. If you notice, this crossing up here is for pedestrian and bicyclists both. And in the past, in order to sign that effectively, you would have needed a pedestrian and a bicyclist sign, but the combination sign allows us to put both those symbols on one sign. We also have signs that warn of large animals. Gives the public the warning to look up, to pay attention. Several of these large animal signs were added in the latest revision of the MUTCD. And talking about new things, there's a couple of signs that we can use to let the public know about changes that we've made to the traffic control pattern or to the traffic control. This shows a new traffic pattern ahead. We can place that sign, and this sign can stay up for as long as it takes the public to realize what that new traffic pattern is, to get used to it, or 6 months, whichever comes first. Let's say we're going to put up a new traffic control signal, or perhaps a new stop sign, and we're going to put a stop ahead out to let the public know that's there. Then we can place a new plaque above it to let people know that, hey, there's a stop where you didn't have it before. And the same thing, that can stay up until the public begins to recognize the situation, or 6 months, whichever comes first. And underneath that particular sign or the intersection ahead signs, we can put street name plaques, advanced street name plaques. I really like these. I find that if you have tourists or older drivers, they're extremely handy to let them know when they need to turn, what's coming up. And if we decide to use these, they have to meet the same letter conventions as our street name signs. And that means that the first letter is going to be capitalized, the rest of the letters are going to be lowercase. And if this is talking about a crossroad where the road to the left has one name, the road to the right has another name, then the road to the left always goes on top, the road to the right on the bottom. Now, if you're talking about using that sign with one of these offset roads or double side road signs, let's take the one at the top left. In that particular case, if I had the advanced street name plaque underneath it, then the sign that the public first encounters would be the one you write on top. And it would have a arrow to the right. This next one to the right would be the one on the bottom, the name on the bottom, and it would have an advanced arrow. It would come up and over to let the public know that's going to be the second one that they encounter. And on these signs, we're allowed to design them to match our intersection coming up. But there are some limits because we don't want to get too many legs hanging off or tick marks hanging off of the main road. So there's a maximum of 3 roads total and a maximum of 2, no more than 2 on one side. And that has a look at some of the MUTCD signs we find in Part 2C and other areas in the manual, as well as a little bit about when we use those signs. Next thing I want to go is Part 3, and I want to look at pavement markings. Talk to you a little bit about the guidance. So hopefully your pavement markings don't look like this. You know, there's a reason that we have guidance, and that is so that all of our pavement markings, they are standard, more easily recognized by the public. So hopefully your crews do a better job than this. This looks a little bit better, but I got to tell you, it's still not right. This stripe down the middle, if we have a no passing zone, the MUTCD says that shall be a double solid yellow line. It cannot be a single stripe. Now this is better. We have 2 edge lines, and we also have the double center line. So hopefully our roads would look like this, more so in our striping. And when I break down the pavement markings in Part 3, the MUTCD breaks them into longitudinal and transverse markings. Right, so longitudinal, you see at the bottom left, that's typically what we call our stripes. The transverse markings are going to be arrows, stop bars, crosswalks, etc. And when we place these, we can use paint, thermoplastic, uh, preformed plastic. I've seen tape as well. The most commonly used is paint. And this says the average life of paint is about 2 years, but really that depends on a lot on how you install the paint, the type of paint you use, and then your weather and the amount of traffic that you have. So let's talk about those longitudinal markings. Just to cover these, I'm sure you're familiar with them, but the broken yellow, that denotes a passing zone. We've got the solid yellow, the broken white lines, the solid white lines. And when I say broken, that's talking about uh, those lines that we use to let people know it's okay to pass. Now that's a little bit different than the dotted white lines that you see down here. At the bottom, the dotted white lines are going to be smaller in size and closer together. So you have broken and dotted white lines. So when we put these lines down, the MUTCD says the width of that line is going to be 4 to 6 inches. And if it's a broken line, then the stripe itself is going to be 10 feet in length. The distance from the end of one stripe to the beginning of the next is going to be 30 feet. It's going to be a ratio of 1 to 3. The dotted line, though, is going to be smaller. It's going to be 2 feet or 3 feet worth of stripe, and it's going to have a 2 to 6 foot gap on the smaller 2-foot stripe or a 9-foot gap on the bigger 3-foot stripe. And I'll tell you what the situations are for those in just a minute. All right, this is showing a centerline stripe, a broken line. It's 4 to 6 inches in width. And then the stripe itself is 10 feet. And then the distance from one to the next in between them is 30 feet. So from the beginning of one to the beginning of the next is 10 plus 30 or 40 feet. So let's talk about these dotted lines. That was a broken line that I just went over, the 10 and the 30 for a total of 40 feet from the beginning of one to the beginning of the next. Let's talk about the dotted lines. Remember, those were either 2 feet or 3 feet, and they had 2 to 6 feet in between them or 9 feet in between them. So one of the times that we would use those is for lane drops or auxiliary lanes. I'll show you an example of that might apply to a city. All right, this is a auxiliary lane between two intersections. And that's what you're seeing over here in the photo on the right-hand side. But this particular way that they have it striped is not correct. That's supposed to be a wide, dotted lane line. That's what it calls it over here in the diagram on the left, a wide, dotted, white lane line. In this particular case, it's going to be the 3-foot stripe with 9 feet in between. And when it says wide, anytime you're looking in the MUTCD and it says a wide line, that means it should be twice the width of whatever size stripe you typically use. If you recall, your stripe can be 4 to 6 inches in width. So if you chose to use a 4-inch line, then your wide lines are going to be 8 inches. So these dotted lines can also be used for lane line extensions, as you see coming through the intersection. And when we use them in this manner, it's going to be the smaller one. It's going to be the 2 foot in width, 2 foot in length with 2 to 6 feet in between it. And then we all know the standards for what color we use. You know, the white markings, that separates traffic flowing in the same direction. It's used on the right edge of the roadway. The yellow markings separate traffic traveling in opposite directions. And now let's talk about different colors. That's the white and the yellow, but there's also purple that's allowed. Purple is a lane line that is allowed for electronic toll collection. And as you see it here, it's not marked appropriately. It should have the purple on the outside, the white on the inside. So to cover those, what does this mean when we see a broken yellow line? Remember the 10 and the 30-foot pattern? That means you can pass. If you have the solid line, you cannot pass. But what about a solid white line? If you have one solid white line, that means that you can change lanes, but you must take care to do so. And now what you're thinking, wait a minute, I didn't think I could cross a single white line. And the answer is, per the MUTCD, you can. When you're not allowed to cross it is when it is a double white line. And we see that a lot in the HUV lanes. Once you get in there, they want you to stay, and they'll place a double white line in that case. And just one of the basic rules of striping I wanted to cover is that when you're striping and you get to an intersection, typically we're going to break those edge lines at that intersection. If it's a driveway, though, we're not. We're going to carry that right on through the driveway. All right, that's a little bit about longitudinal markings or stripes. Now let's take a look at transverse markings, our stop lines, our crosswalks, arrow symbols, etc. So our stop lines, they're going to be white in color. They're going to be 12 to 24 inches in width. And where they're placed is really something that you have to figure out based upon two factors. One, this tells the public where to actually stop, so you want to put it where they have really good sight distance. But you also want to put it far enough back from the intersecting roadway that somebody turning left is not going to hit that vehicle that is stopped at the stop line. Oftentimes it's a judgment call, especially when we're not talking about new design. You're going out there to see where you think it's going to work the best. Now, there are some guidelines as far as how close to the intersecting roadway it can be. It can be no closer than 4 feet and no further away than 30 feet. And the MUTCD does allow us to stagger those stop lines if we have more than one lane, if this is a multi-lane approach. And again, that gives a little bit more room for people to make this left turn movement. Symbols, we can use those on the roadway. We can also use words. Symbols are better than word markings, but if we do decide to use words, then they should fit within the lane. The only one that can extend across more than one lane is the word school. And by the way, if you're putting that word down, I highly encourage you to spell it properly. Otherwise, you might find yourself in one of our presentations, and you definitely don't want to be there. All right, let's talk about crosswalks. The decision to to mark a crosswalk should be based with these considerations. All right, the MUTCD says that they should be marked at these locations based on engineering judgment. One is signalized intersections or on approaches that are controlled by stop or yield signs. So if the public has to stop, let's take a four-way stop or a traffic control signal, there is automatically a crosswalk there. And the public can use that, but it's not a marked crosswalk. And this is saying that they should be marked at these locations based on engineering judgment. Now, where they are not automatically is mid-block, in between two intersections. In between two intersections, if we install a crosswalk there, then the crosswalk lines themselves establish that crosswalk. But that's also a really dangerous spot. If the public isn't stopping already, and we're just asking them to stop for the pedestrians, that's something that takes special care and consideration prior to installing it. With that in mind, mid-block crossings require an engineering study or recommend an engineering study be done prior to installation. And if you're interested in that, you can look in the MUTCD and it gives you guidelines to consider in that engineering study. Now, these crosswalks, when we put them in, they should be at least 6 feet wide, and they can be wider if you think you have more pedestrian volume. And there should be at least 4 feet between the stop line and the crosswalk. When you place the crosswalk markings, you really have three choices of the pattern. And again, these are going to be white in color, but you could use the longitudinal marking, which is pretty standard. It's what we see most often. The diagonal over here on the right-hand side, or the continental on the bottom. And there, the diagonal and the continental are being used to draw more attention to that particular crossing, trying to get the public's attention. And this photo shows you a crosswalk, and it shows you that distance, 4 feet from the stop line to the crosswalk. The crosswalk should also go from one handicap ramp to another. All right. Those are some of the guidelines from the MUTCD, some of the guidelines for striping and transverse markings. So we definitely want to follow these guidelines. Otherwise, again, you might be in our next slideshow. And this is part 2, the end of part 2 of signage and the MUTCD. I've enjoyed sharing this information with you. I hope you've also enjoyed it. And today we talked about the reasons for sign installation, the usage of some of the MUTCD signs, and also what we find as far as pavement marking guidance in Chapter 3 of the MUTCD. We appreciate you watching. Please check out our website for other training opportunities and other great resources.